when you do the reflect in, on, for, from, you build this really wonderful picture of what's possible for you and the opportunities that will unfold.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good afternoon, Dr. Stephen Hobbs, previously episode 525 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just 2 years, 11 months, 20 days since we last had that conversation.
When you listen, you learn. When you share, you educate. And therefore, always continue to improve how you listen, how you learn, how you share, and how you educate. And that way, the world just unfolds in front of you in just a magnificent way.
That was then. This is now. Dr. Stephen, how are you doing today?
I am just wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, well, it's such a grand opportunity. When we first spoke, I think the thing that really stuck out was the introduction to mind mapping. How has that evolved? What's the latest? What's going on in your world today?
Well, I continue to mind map. That it is no shortage of finding pieces of paper all over my desk of drawings, of ways to express what it is that I'm working on. And I guess one of the biggest pushes that I'm making at the moment and drawing it all out is equity funding for revenue generating infrastructure projects around the world. How's that sound?
Ooh, it sounds like fun. I know that, as you said that, like Teresa was doing a pretty huge project in Costa Rica, right? And
Yes.
You're both affiliated in terms of the EBC. I would love to learn more about that. So how are you helping people with that? And how can people access what you're doing?
Well, the members of the Evolutionary Business Council, EBC, I think are tasked, just about every one of them in some way, to make the world better. And I'm going to use that in the greatest and most profound way, is that to make the world better, now individuals better, organizations better, nations better. So there's people working on individuals one-to-one, as there are people working on UN development goals, and people like myself working on nation-based infrastructure projects.
Now, there's a huge educational aspect that goes with understanding how equity can be used and how it can be used wisely, because, again, one of the break-offs of what happened in America was equity financing. And when the market turned around, I mean, there were so many people that were left bankrupt. What's one way you would suggest that people prevent themselves from experiencing a scenario like this?
Well, one of the things, and it goes back to something I always share with people, is define the terms and concepts and then agree on the terms and concepts. So I make a differentiation between equity funding and debt financing. And sometimes we have to just dive into the words that we're using, because when I'm using the term equity funding, what we're saying is that it's available for the use in infrastructure projects that does not incur any debt to the government. And I'll use that one. But the same thing as applies to yourself is, can you find equity funding that does not get you into debt for your business, which is very different than debt financing. So I would always get people, go back and define those terms and concepts of what you're getting involved with.
So how are you doing that? Specifically, the first option, right? Not the debt financing.
Well, to move away from the debt financing, I am working with a business associate out of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And what we're doing is we are approaching governments who have infrastructure projects in their country. And most of the countries we're dealing with have been debt burdened by different groups. And what we're doing is we're saying we have this revised approach. I actually call it a restory approach to financing. And what we do is we call it equity funding rather than the debt financing. And what we do is we figure out with the governments what it is that they're looking for, and we find a way to get them across the line with the paperwork so that we can set up the final project funding agreements and get some projects up and working. And we've been able to do that so far. I think, what is it now? We're 5 projects on 4 different continents. So we're
Wow.
getting there. It's only
Wow.
started a couple of years ago, but we're getting there.
Congratulations. Now, where's the best place for someone that's listening to connect and find out more?
Well, one of the ways is you can go to my website at wealthmovement.com. That's WELLTH movement.com/contact. You can just drop me a note there that you are looking for equity funding for a revenue generating infrastructure project. And I'll help sort out what's the best pathway for you based on what I see there. That might say we'll have a call, or I'll answer some questions that way. So that's the fastest way to get a hold of me.
That's wonderful. One of the things we spoke about was how curiosity was something that led you to learning so many other aspects of life. And of course, I'd like you to dig into that, how that has evolved, as well as you loved creating words. And I
Yes.
know that magnificence, right, was something that you
Mm-hmm.
shared. So I'd love to know how these things have evolved, both curiosity and then magnificence.
Well, the curiosity is always going to be my middle name. There's probably a few other names that will go in the middle, but curiosity has always been there. And I think I may have hinted at it. I don't know. I think I'm on my 35th career now, and I'm still not stopped. I love to dive into different things, and this equity funding program that I've just mentioned is one of them, and curious about how to help a nation get out of debt and help their communities. So that curiosity is still there. It's wonderful that you mentioned the word magnificence again, because that's another one of my middle names, about magnificent significance. But your point about playing with the words, I keep doing that. And I've created something called Steep World. It's my approach to this, helping out countries around the world. And steep it plays with this notion of like a steep incline, but it also stands for social, cultural, technological, environmental, economic, and political. These are the steep climbs that nations have to make to be able to get themselves on track again. So I also, though, associated with sitting down and having a good cup of tea. You know how you steep your tea?
Yes.
And it's this notion of just slowing down sometimes and taking a breath and looking at what's going on and playing with the words like steep and how it applies to the world. Those 5 areas, and slow down a little bit and take a look at what's happening in the world and figure out what you can do to be for the world.
It connects to what we spoke about as well on that conversation: observation and insight and reflection.
Mm-hmm.
How has that impacted your life, and how do you use that today?
Well, I may have mentioned on the call, now it's been a few years, as you mentioned,
Sure.
so I may have said reflection in and reflection on. Those would have been terms that you reflect in your action, all right, and you reflect on your action. It's sort of like reflect in is like being on the dance floor, reflect on is like being up on the balcony looking at the dance floor. But I've added to that now the notion of reflect for and reflect from.
Mhm.
And it's in reference to reflect from is to imagine that imagined future and to bring that insight, those ideas into your presence. And the reflect for is to figure out of what it is that you're going to do. How are you going to move it forward in a number of months or a year? And so when you do the reflect in, on, for, from, you build this really wonderful picture. And I'm going to go back to when you asked, how am I doing? Wonderful. This wonderful picture of what's possible for you and the opportunities that will unfold.
As we plan, as we create, as we reflect, there's an aspect of life that is one that we cannot measure, which is that concept of death, be it
Mm-hmm.
today or be it tomorrow. How do you plan around that conversation? How is your interaction with the possibility that you may die today or tomorrow?
Well, I will use the word legacy. I will share that I've set up my life legacy is that I've written a lot of my own books, and I'm sharing it, and I'm continuing to share that. There are the leadership, what it is that I've done in my own business and people I've touched. There's the legacy aspect of the legal. It's amazing how many people are not prepared legally for this notion of death. And I have my own living will, and I've set out my wills to how to disperse my estate. But there's also this notion of literacy and how literate are you about what's happening in the world and being for the world. But the last one that I would share with you, there's 5 of these parts of legacy, is leverage. You remember I like to play with words?
Mm-hmm.
Love is actually taking leverage and putting the O in instead of the E, so that what you start to understand that there's this paradox we live in, love and rage. But there's also this notion of being with your lover through time, age. And I'm all for the leverage of what you're doing each day, as a way to counter the story of death that's coming, but not to counter it in a way to be scared, but one to embrace it.
I love that. Ooh, well said. Ooh. Dr. Stephen, as usual, it's always a pleasure. These conversations are both inspirational and motivational for me and both the listeners, amazing audience that is listening on the other side. I do appreciate the opportunity to chip in here and find out that you're still doing what you said you were going to do. You've not given up on fulfilling what's core to who you are, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that tremendously. It's evolved. Yes, it has, but you're still staying core to who you are. So my friend, thank you for what you do. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
I would just like to big shout out to you for what it is that you're doing and having all of these quick conversations, but the seeding, I will say, of these really wonderful insights and ideas for the world. So thank you.
You are welcome. Again, amazing audience, Dr. Stephen Hobbs. Great pleasure. I treasure. Thank you for being on what is inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.